Okay, so this is the first lecture for material that's on the final. This is the one. It's titled "Great Disturbance by Global Empires." So basically, it features the way that modern nation states of Europe begin to colonize the world and set up these imperial governments, and basically lead into World War One. So it kind of just bounces around, around the world to see like areas that Europe had actually colonized. So in Middle East, Asia, Africa, etc. Okay, so first slide deals with just the definition of imperialism and colonialism. I would say check your textbook on this, um, and because it is pretty crazy that just think about it that one country would go and basically do a quote unquote like soft invasion of another country, but do it in the name of like progress and civilization and Christianity and things like that. And so one of the reasons why this was done was because one of the popular theories in Europe at the time was social Darwinism. The biggest promoter of social Darwinism, a guy named Herbert Spencer, and basically, social Darwinism is taking Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and applying it to the social realm. So basically, saying like, well, look around you. Europe is on top of the world. We have industry, technology, philosophy, science, etc. And that gives us the right to then go into other parts of the world that are inferior, at least culturally inferior. So that's the paternalism that's involved, is actually going in this kind of almost like quote unquote well intentioned uh, um, uh, move into another country and then utilize the resources for your own benefit, and especially as the growing market economy, the global market economy happens. Now, um, a lot of this was done, again, very, very in a very public way. Most famous example of this is the Berlin Conference of 1884. And you see the political cartoon right here of Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, where he's literally carving up Africa and handing out a piece of pie to each country. And then just to kind of illustrate the fallback of that is you can see majority of Africa is colonized, with the exception of Ethiopia that defeated the Italians and did not get colonized. But pretty much the rest of it is colonized, and I would take some time to look over this map. Um, I would watch the video here as attached. In fact, I'll watch all the videos that are attached to each slide when you go through my Prezi lecture. But what eventually goes on, big picture, is that you have white Europeans going into Africa, Asia in particular at this time, and setting up shop, setting up a culture. And what the long term effect of this is things like the racist apartheid system in South Africa. And again, just pay attention to that in your reading. And I'll talk more about that when we get to the 20th century and when you approach your um, Césaire discourse and colonialism reading, right? Because colonialism is the topic of the book, and I did attach some text to that, particularly Kipling's White Man's Burden and some other texts. So I want you to read all those as good prep to write your paper. Okay, so the worst example of colonialism generally is Africa and the Congo in particular. So the documentary video on the side really goes into depth on the violence of this system. Now, so please watch the video because it'll explain what King Leopold II of Belgium was doing. But the reason why all of a sudden now going into Africa, um, and it's three things. One, they had modern science and medicine, so that means Europeans would go in and not die from disease. Number two, they had mobility, so steamships could move Europeans around. And number three, when people fought back, they had machine guns, so they were able to repel the attack by African groups very easily, actually, because of this the use of the machine gun. What's going on in Latin America? Well, Latin America is a little different than Asia and Africa at this time period, primarily because, as we saw, it had already been colonized. I mean, frankly, we opened the class with the colonization of what would become the Americas. So what happened in Latin America is during the Napoleonic Wars, Spain had become weakened, and that allowed independence groups across Latin America to gain power. So this is the most famous ones are the Bolivarian revolution across South America, and there's a picture of Simon Bolivar there. In fact, there's a Netflix novella about Bolivar that's currently on the streaming service. And then there is the Mexican War of Independence that started with the cry of Hidalgo. And that went on from about the 1810 to about 1821 till Mexico gained independence. Um, so Spain, which we opened up the class and even watched the movie The Mission, basically lost all their territory except Puerto Rico and Cuba um, by the beginning of the 19th century. So that led to nationalism in Latin America, but in particular, the nation states are being ruled by caudillos, which are basically little mini dictators. Most famous ones are Santa Anna in Mexico. Um, and in fact, at one point, you actually had an American named William Walker that tried to take over Central American countries, including Nicaragua and Costa Rica. Um, but so there is this kind of attempt to retake Latin America. Most famous one is probably the French trying to take over Mexico during the this is where the celebration of Cinco de Mayo happens in honor of that. The president during that time period is Benito Juarez, and there's a kind of here's a picture of him over here. He's able to resist the French invasion. This happened around the same time period as the American Civil War, by the way. So, what happens though is that the French are defeated. It's the last attempt, really, by European power to ever take an American territory. And by the time the 19th century rolls around, you actually have Latin American leaders, most of them with Spanish heritage, so they have European heritage. These leaders begin to fall in line with the social Darwinism and positivism that we've been looking at the last few weeks, and actually try to establish kind of a modern nation state based off of countries like England and France, particularly France, and even the United States to some extent. So that leads to a lot of anti-indigenous sentiment. I mean, what else is new about Latin America, right? So that's what's going on in Latin America. So Latin America is not really being colonized in the 19th century, whereas Africa and Asia is. Okay. So this will be the last slide for this mini lecture, and then we'll jump in on the other. Actually, maybe I'll quickly talk about Italy. So, and you should just basically keep reading on the textbook for more on this. But the big turn in 19th century European history is the unification of Germany, right? So he opened up the semester with Luther and the Reformation in Germany. And remember, Germany was not really like a unified nation state. It was kind of a loose federation. Well, even in 1848, there's an attempt to create a nation state, but it failed. But finally, under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, Bismarck is the German chancellor, and he basically uses the authority of this position and the strength of Prussia, because Prussia is one of the stronger regions of Germany. He uses that to basically force this alliance to come into place. And this is what you would call a revolution from above. In other words, it wasn't done by like riots in the streets that we've seen like these type of revolutions throughout France in the 19th century. There's a revolution from the leadership position, and so because there's still a king in Germany, so Bismarck uses diplomacy, uses basically what's called realpolitik, this kind of pragmatic understanding of politics to create alliances and bring Germany together as one unified nation state. And even as a way to answer kind of the socialist, communist voices that are out there, enacts some types of probably the most progressive social legislation in the world at the time. But that was a way just to kind of buttress the cries of these radical labor movements. When Germany goes to war with Prussia, I mean, excuse me, when Prussia goes to war with France in 1870, 1871, around the same time it's going to become unified with the rest of Germany. What's big here is that the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War, well, it leads to, again, the Paris Commune, um, and we talked about that, in previous lecture. But what happens is that now on the continent, so outside of England, all the other European nations, if you think who's the strongest of all these nations, it is now Germany. So Germany is a power to be reckoned with. The British realize this. This will force a number of alliances between countries like Germany, Russia, France, Britain, and the Balkan states as they try to hold some type of independence away from the weakening Ottoman Empire, but also the rise of the Austria-Hungarian Empire that's there. So hopefully you're hearing all this and you're anticipating um, World War One. There's not really a question on Italy's nationalism. I would definitely do the reading. In fact, a lot of the nationalism that is found across the world has its roots in the thought of Giuseppe Mazzini and people like Giuseppe Garibaldi. And in fact, the other great, story of nationalism, unification in 19th century Europe is Italy. It also features the control of the Vatican, so the Pope is basically forced to capitulate to the nationalists. It's a very interesting story, but since I'm not going to really test you on it, I'm not going to take time in this short video summary. Again, I would encourage you to just take the notes from the textbook. And last point, then video is about to end, is the fact that this is a time period where the Catholic Church becomes extremely conservative and reactionary. Basically, this is when the doctrine of papal infallibility happens, and you see language obviously against communism, secularism, anarchism from the Vatican, but also anti-democracy, anti-republicanism as well, and anti-nationalism. So basically, Catholic Church positions itself as anti-anything modern following these events.